And we are live. Good morning, almost everybody. I'm here. I'm Manuela Collarella from Dublin Spontaneous Collective from DiEM 25. And I'm here today with Rory Hearne. Rory Hearne is a social policy lecturer in Maynooth University, and is also a campaign activist. A housing rights activist since a long time, and is also the author of Housing Shock, his most recent book about housing crisis in Dublin. Good morning, Rory, and thank you for being with us today.
Hi, Manuela. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
How are you?
Yeah, good. Yeah, looking forward to this.
So we want to have a chat with you about housing crisis in Dublin for two reasons. First of all, because we are the local node, the Dublin Spontaneous Collective of DiEM 25, and we are all affected as members by it. But also because we think that in a certain sense, Ireland and Dublin are a bit of a laboratory for a neoliberal approach, the financialization of the housing market. And this approach is becoming more evident also in other European cities, and could be the idea of the next years. So it could be interesting to show to our Irish audience, but also to our transnational audience, a little bit of context and information about the housing crisis here, how it happened, why it happened, and what the possible solution could be. So let's pretend I'm a foreigner and that just landed in Dublin. And we meet you in a Dublin pub. I said, Rory, I need to look for a house. I need to look for a room, for accommodation, for an apartment. How is the situation here with housing? And you tell me good luck, of course.
Yeah. Well, I would tell you good luck, and I would be very worried for you. And I think that I would hope that you brought a lot of money with you. And I think that to explain, the housing situation here in Dublin and in other cities across Ireland, it's unfortunately a situation, a housing situation. It's a housing crisis that is similar to other European cities, cities in North America, indeed across the world, where housing has become increasingly unaffordable to normal people, ordinary people, workers, students, people who are on low incomes. And if we look at what has happened in Ireland and in Dublin, that historically, and this is what I talk a lot about in the book, that countries and governments in the 20th century, particularly after the First World War, from the early 1920s into the 1930s, 40s, and then after the Second World War, governments really started building what we call public housing. And this was in large part in recognition that the kind of market approach, what was called the laissez-faire economic approach, that allowed housing be provided essentially by landlords, private landlords, builders, financiers, that this didn't provide housing for workers, essentially, that workers were in a serious, were living in slums. In Dublin, for example, in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, we had some of the worst slums in Europe, but this existed across Europe. Workers' housing was terrible situations, and there was protest, part of the workers' movement back in the early part of the 20th century, part of the socialist movements. Housing was a core part of that. Housing was a core demand. And it's very interesting in the research for my book. I read back what the Irish socialist and Republican James Connolly, who you might have heard of, he was a famous revolutionary, he wrote about it at the time, at the housing crisis in the 1890s. And it's incredible how similar what he wrote then is to what we see today, which is he talks about the landlords excessively profiting from housing, the failure of the local councils to take responsibility for housing quality. And what he argued for was that the state should build rental housing that covers the basically and charges rents that cover the cost of the building of the housing, and so is not related to the market rent. And that's called now generally public housing or cost rental housing. But what is interesting is that over the last, why I talk about this is because when I looked at it, over the last 30 years, really, governments across Europe and across the world have moved away from building public housing to over-relying for the housing, provision of housing to the private market. And we have this process of financialization, which is where initially in the 1980s and 1990s, it was about mortgages, that everybody was encouraged to become a homeowner. It was lots of lending from the banks. They were giving what we called here like 100% mortgages, so you didn't need to even have a deposit. Some banks actually gave people the deposit and the loan. And there was this huge excessive kind of debt bubble, of course, that burst in 2008. And since 2008, what we've seen is this process of financialization has changed from people being given mortgages to now these real estate investment funds are now the kind of the main new providers of housing. And people in the past who were getting mortgages are now being forced to rent from these real estate funds. And of course, the rents they're being charged are, in Dublin, insane prices, like over 2,500 for 3-bedroom apartments, 3,000 for 3-bedroom apartments. Families can't afford this money. And it's similar across Europe. I know that. And so I suppose explaining the crisis is one of that there's a huge lack of affordable housing. And in large part, it's because governments have stopped building public housing, social housing, and they turn to the market, and not just the market, but they turn to these global investment funds whose only interest and involvement in housing is extracting as much profit and rents as possible from it.
Yeah, I'm curious about this role of the financialization, and you talk a lot in the book about the role of NAMA in that. And this is something probably our viewers from out of Ireland are not very familiar with it. Can you explain how the bailout and the following austerity had a role in making housing so expensive, and why just rely on private builders and private players does not work? It's not so simple, why we need an investment from the state in this.
Yeah, and it's very I suppose relevant now in the COVID, the post kind of COVID context, or we're still in the COVID crisis and the economic crisis that's associated with that to look back at what happened in the last financial crisis and how the way in which governments responded actually led to this kind of worsening housing crisis we're in, and how we can learn from that. So in response to the 2008 financial crisis, the Irish government set up what was called the National Asset Management Agency, which is called NAMA, which essentially took bad debts loans off the banks, and essentially allowed the banks then to go off to lending, that their toxic, a lot of their toxic loans, the debt and the land and properties associated with them were taken off the banks at a discount, a significant discount. And essentially it was the way the Irish state bailed out the banks, and they wrote off their debt essentially and took it on to this state management agency. And what the state management agency, NAMA, did then was initially in 2010, 2011, there wasn't a lot of movement in it. Held on to its land, its assets. It had billions worth of land, property, residential property throughout Dublin, throughout Ireland, huge amount of land, massive amount of land. And what it did then, as the economy was still in a major recession, it was holding on to its assets. But then as the economy started to change and economic growth returned and property prices started to increase, even marginally in 2011 and 12, the NAMA turned to these global vulture funds and financial funds and essentially started to sell off this land and properties and debt to these global funds. And in a way, what I describe this is that NAMA, which was a state agency, essentially facilitated this financialization of the Irish housing market and Dublin's housing market, which has led to major problems and has brought in this whole build to rent kind of process now, where we're seeing global funds buying up property. And so NAMA sold off a lot of this property at a discount to global financial funds to try and essentially basically offload this debt. And rather than seeing, how could it use this huge land bank, these properties, to provide affordable housing, the government directed it essentially just to sell them off. And real estate funds were started up. Ireland's real estate funds industry was started up by NAMA. And now we had the situation whereby global funds like Lone Star, there's many of them, and actually most of the global funds that NAMA sold its land and property were US-based funds. And some of them have hoarded their land, so they haven't built on the land. The land lies idle. And of course, in that context, house prices rise. Others are now building these really expensive rental properties and buying up, for example, pushing out people who are first-time buyers, like new people who want to buy a home, can't compete with these global funds who are buying up the properties to rent them out. And so what I describe this as is a process of kind of commodifying housing, that housing is being removed from something that ordinary people can afford, a kind of a social good, a social need, to something that these global funds and are essentially turning into a commodity that they trade and they buy. And that this process, which started with neoliberal policies 30 years ago, is really getting much worse under this whole real estate fund process. And it's a very dangerous situation where we're seeing most new apartments in Dublin, for example, that are being built are being bought up by these real estate funds, and they're charging huge rents. And it said that young or people who are trying to buy a home can't compete with them.
So basically, now in Dublin, there is a sort of oligopoly situation where a few funds have a portfolio of hundreds, thousands of apartments and houses.
Yeah,
so they make the prices as they like.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And that's kind of what our own department, our government department of finance, did a study on these real estate funds and how they were affecting the local housing situation. And they found that in certain parts of Dublin, these funds were now controlling maybe 40 or 50% of the apartments in that area. And that while if you look at it overall in our housing system, the funds maybe only control 2 or 3% of the total property. But if you look at these local areas, particularly in the cities, they control, as I say, 50, 60% of apartments. And so therefore, you're right, they set this. And part of the problem is that our rents, market rents, are decided on the number of properties in an area. What is the rent? So if they control a lot of the rental properties, they can essentially set the market rent. And that, of course, leads to rent rises across the board. And so you are seeing this oligopolistic situation whereby they are controlling the market, they are controlling the rents and charging as high as what they can. And
part of the problem is that tenants' rights are quite weak. So you can have your rent raised from one month to the other without warning. There is no limit to the difference in prices in money can ask to you suddenly.
Yeah. And that is a big issue in Ireland, that, and it's something that other European countries, could look at and be very worried about, tenants particularly, that we don't have strong protections for tenants. Traditionally in Ireland, we have promoted home ownership as being the main way that people access housing, and then a limited amount of kind of public or social housing. We never developed housing like the public affordable, rental housing in Vienna, for example, in Austria, or cooperative housing in Sweden and even Italy as well. We had a very strong, what's called kind of socialized home ownership. So the state played a really strong role in ensuring people had access to home ownership or this very low rent social housing. But what has happened, so therefore in that context, we never gave renters rights. But in the 1990s and in the 2000s, landlords basically, this new wave of investor landlords were attracted in, initially who were Irish, kind of small-time enterprise, middle-class people were given loans to buy, a rental property. And after the crash, that has now turned into these global investment funds. But essentially, rental housing is very much seen as an investment and not as a home. And that is part of the core of our kind of crisis, is that we have seen a huge increase in homelessness and this phenomenon of families becoming homeless. We have over 10,000 families and 10,000 individuals homeless in Ireland now. We have 3,000 children, over 3,500 children, thousands of families made homeless, largely from the private rental sector. They can't afford the private rents, and they don't have protection from eviction. And so one of the things in Irish law is that,
to be clear for our international viewers, if I am a single mom with 3 children and something happened, I lose my job, I can be evicted from my apartment in a very short time.
Yes, in a relatively, you can. That there is state housing subsidy available called the Rent Supplement Scheme or the Housing Assistance Payment Scheme, whereby you can apply for that. But the problem is, a landlord can say, I don't want to accept that payment.
They have the power to choose to discriminate people that are on welfare.
Even though it's illegal, it's actually illegal under our law, under equality laws, that you cannot discriminate on the basis of where someone earns their income from. So if you were in receipt of welfare payments at a landlord, in the law, it's against the law to discriminate. But in reality, there's very little enforcement of that law.
You can claim just another reason.
Yes, you claim another reason.
Someone else, for example.
Yes. So landlords in the current law can evict somebody on relatively short-term notice within a few months. If they say they want to sell the property, or if they want to, this is a reason to move their family member into the property. And I don't know if there's any other European country that has these laws that are so anti-tenant and so in favor of landlords. And essentially it means that you cannot make a home in the private rental sector in Ireland. And why that's very significant is that we have the huge increase since the kind of in mid-2000s, over the last kind of 15 years, of young people in particular, and I call these generation rent, who are, many of them on precarious jobs, short-term contracts. In the past, they might have got mortgages, but now they can't get mortgages because of their economic situation, or they can't save to get a deposit, or it's simply they can't compete with the vulture funds and the real estate funds. So they now are reliant on the private rental sector for housing. And we have had a doubling in the number of people who are in the private rental sector in the last 10 years. A fifth of our population now live in the private rental sector, and many of them are migrants as well. Many of them are low income, and many of them are families, yet they live in a situation of perpetual insecurity. A landlord at any point can turn around and evict them for these reasons. And I think that that's one of the laws that could be changed immediately, that those provisions could be removed from the legislation. And I think that the government should say to landlords, you are providing people with a home. That is your primary service. This is not just an investment asset for you to do whatever you want with it.
Yeah, of course. You're not selling a luxury clothing or something that, a notion to say in the Irish way. You're providing something that is essential to the well-being of people and is a human right. And that's also when you try to think about the solution in your book, you suggest that a new approach in terms of housing as a human right is necessary to change the mindsetting and what we expect from the state in terms of housing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously this isn't a new idea, in that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, adequate housing, or housing, was included as a necessity for people to have an adequate standard of living. But there is no doubt that over the last 15-20 years, partially in response to neoliberalism and the marketization of housing, there has been a growing movement and calls internationally for housing to be increasingly treated as a human right. And in the United Nations International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights, the right to housing is set out there as something that people have, everyone should have access to. What does the right to housing mean? It means affordable housing. It means housing that's secure, and that is of a decent standard. And under the new European Pillar of Social Rights developed by the European Union, housing is included as a social right within that as well. But the part of the problem is that many countries don't have a legal right to housing. And I think that part of the mindset that needs to change is that we look at healthcare, for example, or we look at education, and we don't think it's acceptable, for example, that a child should have to go without an education. We think that, no, absolutely, every child should have the right to access education. Every child should have the right to access healthcare if they need it. So why do we not say the same with housing? Why do we not say that every child, every individual should have the access to affordable, secure housing? Now, that can come in different formats, but it should be in law. It should be the government's responsibility to ensure, not to build everyone a home or to give everyone a free home, that's this notion, but to actually ensure that the market works so that it provides housing, to ensure you build enough public housing that everybody has access, and you provide strong tenants' rights and security, and you control, for example, taxing investors. But we should put the right to housing, I believe, in our constitution. It should set that out very clearly. I think we need a referendum to include that right in our constitution. And then I think it should be put into our laws. It should be in, and I think our housing policy, and the former UN rapporteur Leilani Farah, who wrote the foreword for my book, has been very clear on this and very strong in setting out that housing policies developed by governments and housing strategies should have their starting point as the ambition that every person has their right to housing delivered. And the part of the problem in the Irish government has been that our housing policy hasn't even mentioned the right to housing.
Okay. But in looking, well, it will not be easy, in my opinion, to obtain this referendum without a mass movement demanding for this. There is what's slowly is growing and growing in Ireland as well. You have a chapter on your book about housing movement and how they start to form groups and empower people in the housing estates, because there's also not only a problem of the lack of social housing, but there is also an issue here with the renovation, requalification of old housing estates, and there is basically aimed at breaking communities. And we have been part of a housing activist group that in that sense was a bit successful to negotiate something better than that. I think that was very interesting part of your book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I suppose there's two things there. And the first one is the issue of this kind of regeneration is what it's called of old social housing estates. And this is a big issue across Europe and internationally, of social housing, public housing that was built in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, many of it high rise, that needs refurbishment, because housing needs to be refurbishment, brought up to new living standards. And I worked in a one of the social housing communities as a community worker and policy worker for many years. And during this period of 2006, and during the boom, they proposed what were called public-private partnerships, whereby they would get private financiers, private developers in on public land, public estates, and essentially reduce the amount of social housing on the estate, give over half the land to a private developer who would build all the housing and would make lots of money from the private housing, and the state then would get this new social housing. Essentially, they describe it for free. Of course, it wasn't for free. The developer was getting a huge subsidy of the public land. And the state was getting this idea that they said, well, we don't want big social housing estates anymore. We just want to reduce it. And of course, what the issue with this is that many of these were very strong working class communities where people had lived for generations. And people saw the value of that public land, and that should be maintained for public provision of housing. But what happened is there was an issue there of, and this is an issue, that public housing became run down, that they stopped maintaining it. And this links into this wider stigmatization of social housing. And so what I was involved with was part of a community campaign that used a human rights approach called the Dolphin House and Rialto Rights in Action program. And we worked with the tenants on the estate and spoke with them, and said, you have a right to live in decent standard housing. And this is, of course, part of the reason why governments don't want to progress a right to housing, because they don't want tenants, people from low-income backgrounds, people suffering from housing crisis, to actually believe they have a right to this. They think that they do not want them to.
But they organize, because that's the thing. If people with that kind of rights are together and start to organize, they become a problem. So
absolutely, yeah, they highlight a social problem. They highlight failures of government, and they become a strong voice, and they become empowered, which is what we did. Now, it was a very small community, it was a very small area, but it was very successful in making the case for the building of public housing on public land. And since then, the state did agree to it because of the pressure from the community, and it has built new public housing. There's been no private housing built on that land. And the issue is, though, that I think that part of the problem is there's two parts. One is that our view, and this is what I make the case for in the book, is that social housing should not be something that's just limited to low-income groups. And that is part of the problem why it becomes stigmatized. Whereas if you look in places like Vienna is a great example, where public housing is available to anybody on any income, that then you get this mix of people from different backgrounds. And also the state and the public should be proud of its public housing. It should build the best housing that's built. It should be beautiful housing that's well designed with gardens and community facilities. And it should not be this stigmatized poor housing. Why should we provide, why should we provide this such low standard? It should be something that people should aspire to. And that, of course, goes back to historically, people argued for public housing in the 19th century and 20th century should be beautiful, these city beautiful movements. And I think we need to get back to that. But also, I think to get to there, and this is your point, that we need social movements. We need citizens to be involved in changing this, because the state does not want to go back to being responsible for housing. It believes it should be in the market's responsibility. To get that change, citizens have to take action, and they can do that in many ways. I think as well that the whole cooperative approach to housing, and we have a cooperative, Oculon cooperative building affordable housing, and I make this idea that we don't want to return to a kind of a bureaucratic state that just builds public housing that that the communities aren't involved in designing or maintaining or participating. We need a participative form of public housing provision that is inclusive and engaged. And I think, in Dublin, we've seen in Ireland new movements like the Raise the Roof campaign, the Homeless and Housing Coalition campaign. We've seen local NGOs like Simon Community and Focus all engaging in action and pressuring government for change. And we have a new government now that has promised a referendum on housing, not clear that it's the right to housing, but is promising to build public housing. But I think that the civil society movements will have to continue to pressure for the major change that's needed.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of movements, of course, since these things, as we have seen, have not only local causes, as we have seen with the Vulture Fund, there's a local element in the conditions that has creating this kind of solution, but there is also a global element of what the finance market thinks as see as profitable. At a certain point, housing became the profitable business, and this Vulture Fund came here in a moment of crisis and took advantage of that. We, as a pan-European movement, we strongly believe that we should exchange between different European cities information about things that we have in common. For example, in this case, in the issues that we have in common, worst practices that we don't have to copy to each other, best practices, and so on. Since you have been involved also in research project at European level, right? How is doing Dublin comparing to other cities? These Vulture Fund that are here are doing the same things in other cities. Do we face like a common global, let's say, enemy that we deal with, or it's just a situation specific to Dublin?
No, it's very clearly this is an international phenomenon. The issue of real estate funds taking over, trying to really get more involved in building, in particular, this whole concept of the build to rent model, where they're building housing for the new generation rent, and essentially removing any prospect of this new generation getting any affordable housing, and really seeing them as their future profit market. This is happening across European cities, from Barcelona to Berlin. It's happening in Amsterdam. It's happening across that.
It's happening also in cities that had traditionally a different model about housing. Yeah. Now it's transforming in the worst way.
Yes, it is, absolutely. In places we've seen, and in a large reason of this is essentially because governments and local municipalities in these countries also started to buy into and accept the neoliberal approach and marketize social housing. We've seen that in the Netherlands, in Sweden, countries that had fantastic histories of providing social housing for everybody, turned to the market and accepted this idea that somehow, local authority and government should no longer be the main, a large provider of housing. And in a way, what we're seeing in Dublin is an extreme end of a process of marketization of housing that's happening in European cities. And the good thing is that citizens across these European cities are also responding. Particularly, we have seen movements in Berlin, we've seen movements in Barcelona, and local authorities increasingly as well, pushing back and trying to assert a right to housing, particularly, for example, challenging Airbnb and the short-term let platforms. And obviously there's a European role, particularly for the likes of the European Investment Bank, to support investing in public housing. There's a whole question of the EU rules and how they restrict the ability to invest in social housing, the definition of what is social housing. There's major issues at a European level that people need to come together to on a cross-European level to assert the right to housing. There's obviously, just as we had in terms of the European petition around the right to water, there's possibilities for petitioning around the right to housing at a European level. How could that be made stronger? Europe protects and believes in the right to housing.
We have about this a question from our audience. If there is there a movement for a rent strike coordinated with what is going on elsewhere in Europe? There are movements at the moment in the rest of Europe that are trying to organize for rent strikes, and some of our DiEMers are involved in that in France and Luxembourg at the moment, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful a strategy, and a really important strategy. And historically, for renters, that has been a really big tool. That it's the power they have to stop paying their rent. I think that different countries have different situations. In Ireland, for example, tenants are very vulnerable, and they don't have the rights that other tenants have in other European countries. And so, if they engage in rent strikes, the question will be, are they even more vulnerable, and how they do that? I think part of the challenge in Ireland is that we don't have historic organizations of tenants. We don't have tenants organizations. And at this point, I know that there's the campaign.
There are very recent. There are groups.
Yeah, yes, there are groups. Yeah, like CATU, for example. There's new tenants unions trying to be formed. And I think that that's really important that they do that. Tenants need to get organized. And I think that the other issue is that we face an immediate crisis here is the whole, we've had the moratorium on evictions. So as a response to COVID, there was a ban on any evictions from the private sector put in place, and a control on rents put in place. And since they have been put in place since March, the level of homelessness, of new people becoming homeless, has collapsed. It's basically gone from hundreds of families being made homeless to literally very few being made homeless. And it shows that we can solve this housing crisis. It shows that measures the government do can make a major difference. But the challenge is, how do we keep those measures put in place?
That was very interesting about the pandemic impact, because again, for people outside Ireland, one of the arguments that is used generally from Irish establishment to put a limit to rents, to rent cap and so on, is that it is unconstitutional, that it goes against the constitutional protected right about private property. Suddenly, in the middle of pandemic, this was not a problem anymore. And there were action from the government to provide shelter for homeless people, to not leave them out in the streets in the middle of the pandemic, because suddenly that became a public health problem. So it was everybody's problem, and it needed a solution. So it shows sometimes also as a pan-European movement, we are told, it's impossible to change European treaties, there is no solution, and so on. I firmly believe that political will can change everything. And we have seen it here during the pandemic, at transnational level during the pandemic, and how also at European level, a lot of things that were no the first day became maybe the second day. They came, okay, let's talk about that the third day. So it's about how much pressure we put in it, really. And I really second what you said about different countries need set different strategies. And in that I can see how you are not only an academic, but a person who really works with people in a housing distress, because seeing things from their point of view is the most important thing, and see how the impact of a strategy that someone thinks can, consider the consequences and think about strategies that are not more harmful than resolving, what I mean. So
yeah, absolutely. You have to think about how these strategies and tactics affect the people who are directly affected, and what, it's important that it comes from them as well. And that's what's, the grassroots movements, housing movements in Ireland have really tried to do that. They've involved people directly affected in that change. But I think the pandemic absolutely showed that, governments can put in place policies overnight that can have massive impacts on beneficial impacts on housing and homelessness. and that we should be demanding that that's what's done. And so, in a way, the COVID has revealed both kind of huge inequalities in housing, but also huge possibilities as well.
It also showed the impact of BNB platform on the housing market as well. That was always denied, and what we have seen with that during the pandemic here.
Yes, the other issue is, of course, with the collapse in tourism, that we have thousands of properties available across the country, extra, which were being used for the short-term holiday market, the Airbnb platform, and they have become available for renting. Some of them have been used to house homeless people. And it shows, though, it absolutely shows that the impact, the very negative impact of these short-term platforms on housing in cities and making less housing available for homes. And again, it's part of this financialization, commodifying housing. And I think that there really needs to be a move now to ban these in areas of major housing crisis, and the platforms that are used. And even I saw, in Dublin City, I actually posted a tweet on it there last week, where in a city centre area where I took a picture where on one side of the street was a social housing apartment complex that had been built probably in the 1960s or 70s. And on the other side of the street was being built a huge apartment complex, but they were being built as apart hotels. And I said, this is the example. In the past, we used to build homes for people. Now we build, these short-term apartments for tourism. And it's just wrong. It's wrong. It makes cities unlivable for ordinary people, and cities should prioritize people's homes. Unfortunately, I have to go.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I wanted to talk about you. Any couple of minutes just to talk about solutions.
Yeah. Sorry.
You mentioned a Green New Deal for housing, and we are very happy about that. Because at European level, we are promoting a Green New Deal campaign for Europe, and housing is also included about that. What are your proposals on that side?
So I make the proposal that for at an Irish in Ireland, that the climate crisis, and obviously before the COVID, it was one of the main crises that we were facing, and of course we still face it, and we need to talk about it still. That housing and residential development makes a major contribution to our carbon dioxide, CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, and that in particular the way in which our homes are heated, the type of energy use, the way they're designed, and the way they're insulated really makes a difference in terms of our contribution to climate change. And there was two things needed, I felt, that in housing that can contribute to making our economies and societies more resilient and meeting climate targets. One of them is that in any new housing that's being built, public housing in particular, that if you build public housing, you can ensure that it is zero carbon. And this is something the state could do. Whereas the private market will try and reduce the cost and not necessarily do zero carbon housing. The state can, and it should do. And I think at a European level, there should be a major investment plan in all new public housing being supported by the European Investment Bank, and local governments should invest in this new form of zero carbon public housing. And of course, that will mean addressing energy poverty as well, because you'll have much lower energy bills for people who are living in them, and they make these sustainable homes. The other part is that there's retrofitting needed. There's major refurbishment needed of existing housing, and particularly rental housing, but also housing that's owned by people. And people can't afford to do this. They can't afford to put in place the energy measures that are needed in their homes, the changes needed. So the state has to fund that, I think, and subsidize that. And in that way, I argued that building public housing that's zero carbon, retrofitting homes, refurbishing them, meeting environmental targets, will not just help the environment, but also help social inclusion, help equality. And so I make this case that as part of a Green New Deal, housing can be a key part of that and should be a key part of that.
Just to leave you free, and I just make a short addition, and I'm very happy about that we found out the same solution as we advocate in the Green New Deal campaign. About costing, you suggest basically green bonds from a major role from the European Investment Bank, for example. And here specifically talk about Ireland and its little problem on financial justice side, that a great wealth is produced in this country, and a major distribution of that could be helpful in housing terms as well. So to do that, we need a reverse, a total transformation of political mindsetting here and in Europe. That probably would need another episode to discuss how we obtain that, how we go we reach that goal, and how much time realistically we can do that. It's something as progressive in Europe and Ireland. We are all trying to do our part on that. I think there is a good chance for Ireland in the next years. The situation is fluid and is changing. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And see you maybe in the next time for discussing the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.